we talk about this thing is there are some just key facts that I want to highlight, which makes it very important for us to talk about all these things. First of all, we have to acknowledge or recognize that we are all live and work in a boundary of a municipality or local government. In certain areas, they call it municipality or local government, so we use them interchangeably during the session. And as a result, our quality of life is impacted by how the municipalities invest and look after the infrastructure that we normally use, things like roads, your water, your electricity, and so on and so on. And furthermore, all economic activities, they all happen within a municipal space. So that is an indication that municipalities are very critical. And when we talk about financing, it's something that we cannot ignore, but we have to talk about it. And then one other thing is that when we say even economic activities, they happen within the space of a municipality, it means the infrastructure which they have to provide to ensure, to enable the economic activity to happen, it has to ensure that it can do that without any failure. And then it has to support the performance of our economies as countries. And then so municipalities around the world, they are faced with many challenges in South Africa, in Mozambique, in wherever, all the countries, most of our cities or all our cities, they are facing different challenges. And what are these challenges? Some of them is that they are facing the urbanization. I mean, it's an issue which everybody knows. Urbanization is a reality, and it happens or it affects most of our cities in most cases. And what does that mean? It means if there's an urbanization, there's a need for municipalities or other cities to ensure that they expand their investment for infrastructure in order for them to service for the growing population. And one other challenge which they are also facing is that they have to respond to the issues around the climate change. I mean, everybody now is talking about climate change. It's a reality, it's an issue which we cannot ignore, but to look into how then do we deal with that. And the other one is they also have to respond to the new priorities which we are all developing, things around your new urban agenda. These are the things which as municipalities they have to be looking into and they have to respond to. And all these things, they are happening when everybody is talking about economic growth in each and every country. So what does it mean? It means that as municipalities, they have to be well funded. And as municipalities, they have to be functioning properly. The question that we need to ask ourselves is then, how then do we unlock finances that will enable these municipalities to ensure that they can finance themselves, they can have infrastructure that will focus on all these responsibilities which they need to which they need to respond to. And it's a general thing which everybody talks about to say municipalities, they're the engine of growth because everything happens in municipalities. So the main purpose of this section is to look into what are the different views of stakeholders on how they can unlock financing to ensure that municipalities, they can be funded or they can have funding which is required for them to respond to all these pressing needs that are coming up, to all these new responsibilities that are coming, is either from the national government or even from the private sector. So that is the main purpose. So we are going to have different views from various stakeholders here. You can see the number of them. So the engagement is going to be rich, and I'm hoping that our panelists here, they're going to make it very exciting. I'm told this is the first special session that we're having for this conference. So we have a mandate to make it exciting, to make it lively, to make it exactly. I'm getting a commitment from the panelists that we are going to make it lively and interesting. Then as a first respondent, or as a first person that I have here to talk from the national government is Mr. Isaac Massamba. He's the Minister for Urban Development in Uganda. He's going to talk to us about what are the views of national government. The things about that I was talking about, it all talks to the issues around what are the game changers that we need to put in place, things around things around your policies that we have in place. Do you think all these things, which are the game changers, are they enabling local government? Are they making them, or are they constraining local government to ensure that they access financing which they require in order for them to meet all these developments which we require for them? So I'll hand over to Mr. Isaac Massamba to tell us from the national government perspective on what are their views about all these issues.
Thank you very much. Being heard? Okay. Thank you very much, lady moderator. The issue of financing of local governments, first of all, is critical in ensuring that we, in the 2030 Agenda of Sustainable Development, we deliver on this agenda through adequate financing. And therefore, both local and national governments must undertake reforms to increase local financing and create a conducive environment for investment. Now, unfortunately, in Uganda, a country that I'm familiar with, financing, or rather raising money in the local governments or in the urban areas is a subject to the Public Finance Act, Public Finance Management Act, which says all revenue collected in that municipality or in that urban area must be remitted to the central government, to the consolidated fund, all of it. And then it will be subject to appropriation through the normal process of appropriating. And the government is vigilant in ensuring that that provision is adhered to, is enforced. You must submit all the revenue to the consolidated fund. What the government is not equally or with the same enthusiasm active about is ensuring that what has been sent to the consolidated fund is sent back to the local governments through appropriation. So there is a mismatch in most of the cases. And therefore, we would like to have a discussion where we think outside the box. What other areas can the government allow local governments to use in order to finance the all and most important activities in their jurisdiction? Ordinarily, financing of urban investments will involve several aspects of local government fiscal matters, such as public finance, administrative measures, taxation, monitoring and controlling of sub-sovereign debt, and so on. It also involves land management, land development, housing. But for us to be able to benefit from these, we need to refine how this triangular relationship is going to be managed. And therefore, I wanted to put on the table the following. One, that maybe we should consider land-based financing and user charges, meaning cities can leverage the value of their existing assets mainly land and property, to generate revenue for smarter and more sustainable infrastructure investment. Let there be an opportunity for the government to allow the central government, to allow the local governments design and encourage development of property taxes, retain these, and be able to use this to retrofit slums, upgrade them, and also avail tax incentives for people who involve themselves in city development. We need also to have land value capture. This can be done by taxing the increased value of the land due to public spending on the infrastructure that services it. In other jurisdictions, it's called betterment levies. This must be allowed to exist in the municipalities because that's where value addition to the land has an immediate and tangible result of increased value in the investment. So I want us to see whether betterment levies are usable. Now, the PPP, this public-private partnership, should not just be left to the government, the central government, but the local government should be allowed to initiate and implement private sector operators to finance part of the investment on a PPP basis or BOT basis, give them 30 years to recover from a city tram if they have built one, and this should be able to help encourage investors to come and invest in the understanding that they will be able to recover their investment. We should look at redirecting existing infrastructure funding towards more compact, connected and coordinated urban infrastructure development, including the existing national urban infrastructure funds and other relevant funding vehicles. There are also views that we should look at congestion charges, because some of these urban areas are actually congested, and this money, once collected, which should help to deal with the environmental charges, the environmental situation as well, should be kept by the local governments, the local authorities, to finance their much needed investments. And finally, we should be able to introduce new mechanisms to finance upfront investment in smarter urban infrastructure, new technology. These will include greater use of land value capture mechanism, municipal bonds, because if you take away all the money to the central government, then there will be no basis for a municipal bond. People should be able to retain money where they are, and also the creation of a dedicated national, region, and city-level investment platform to prepare and package investment to attract private sector capital. Madam, it is also proposed that maybe retention of fines. For example, traffic fines, traffic offense fines, traffic fines. If there are traffic fines, why can't we share? Maybe 30% goes to the central government, 30% is kept by the police, which is implementing, and 30% or 40% kept by the local government where the offense is being committed. A sharing like that one will bring everybody on board, and this should also be extended to any environmental levies or any levies whatsoever or fines that are put in place by that local authority. In conclusion, there is need for continuous dialogue and sharing of local experience to the best financing. This will reduce on the amount of money we seek from international donors, who they themselves also are in need of spending less on donations. I thank you.
Thank you, Minister. There's something remarkable that you're saying about the issues around the sharing. What I wanted to check or to highlight is because this will differ from country to countries. Like, for example, in South Africa, you will have a situation where certain financing, like your property tax, when it's collected, is taken by the local government themselves, is not given to the central government. Is there any view or any appetite from your country to look into, because this goes back to the issues around the legislation, to look into those areas to say, how then do we decentralize the system? Is there any appetite to also look into those kind of reforms, perhaps maybe?
Right now, we have lonely voices, really. The arguments against this is there. What is the capacity of the local government in managing these finances? Corruption. Lack of appropriate personnel for implementation. Giving a wrong picture or a deceptive picture of our macroeconomic situation by decentralized collection and expenditure, which does not reflect in the national percentage of revenue or as a percentage of GDP, and so on. Issues like that have affected the mindset of the policymakers, and ours is still a lonely voice. Ours, meaning the people who want the local governments to retain this money, is still a far-off cry. And that's the reality.
Okay. Thank you, Minister. I think the issue around the management of funding is a global issue which all of us, we are grappling with on how municipalities can best manage the financing of themselves, and also the issues around corruption is something that we all have to look into with a very close eye. I will take a view or comment from the Mr. Samuel Waba. You pardon me if I'm not pronouncing your name correctly. He's a Global Director for Urban Disaster Risk Management and Resilience and learned global practice from the World Bank. What are your views about all these issues? What are the things which the FIs can do to ensure that municipalities can access financing? What is the right environment that has to be created to ensure that the DFIs can come on board and play that critical and impactful role in local government?
Excellent. Thank you very much, Madam Moderator. And good afternoon to all. It's a pleasure to be here. From the perspective of the World Bank, I think the Minister has made it very clear. I mean, there's a very large volume of financing needs that's out there, that there is an expectation that municipalities and subnational governments would fill, yet at the same time there are not always the right level of resources. And what we know is, for instance, the solution to this is not what the IFIs could contribute, because at the end of the day, the amount of available funding is very much limited. The reality is you need a compendium of solutions that spans across the entire range of financing instruments to be able to cover the funding gaps that are available out there. So for starters, the most important revenue source is municipal own source revenues. So helping basically boost municipal finances and improve own source revenue generation becomes a very critical first step. Instruments as basic as property taxation or user fees, charges, levies, and so on and so forth are critical as part of the arsenal of tools that are available to municipalities, obviously provided that the regulatory environment exists. The second one, which tends to be also underestimated, is intergovernmental fiscal transfers. I mean, these are, for the large majority of the municipalities that the World Bank works with, these are the dominant source of finances that are available out there. Usually municipal own source revenues tend to be limited, and subnational governments, specifically municipalities, rely significantly on the transfers of resources that central governments make to them. But these are very rarely formula-based, very rarely predictable, transparent flows of funds, they usually, in many places tend to either, favor certain type of localities, like maybe, rural areas over urban areas, etc. And therefore, being able to structure the intergovernmental fiscal transfer system becomes a critical second step. The third, which is again out of the reach of many of the cities that we work with, but it's a long process that needs to be started, is the whole notion of municipal borrowing or municipal debt, because at the end of the day, this requires a large range of issues, starting from a strong revenue base and asset management, basically debt management, and so on and so forth, to put the municipality on a path of creditworthiness. And of course, there needs to be a national enabling regulatory environment governing the municipal borrowing and subnational government indebtedness. And then beyond that, obviously, there's a lot of potential and unfortunately little facts. But there is a tremendous role that the private sector can bring in terms of private participation in infrastructure, whether it's PPPs in service delivery or otherwise. And then finally, obviously, land value capture plays an important role, an increasingly important role. It's a tool that's out there. I think we're all discussing about it, but it hasn't been practiced everywhere. I think Latin America is one of the parts of the developing world that have actually advanced very much land value capture, whether through ex-ante sale of development rights, like in Sao Paulo, the certificates of additional construction potential, or betterment levies in places like Colombia and otherwise. But again, a tool with a lot of instruments. So what does the World Bank do with regards to this arsenal of financial instruments? The first thing is we use the investments that we do practically in every municipal operation, whether it's a single municipality or it has multiple cities or municipalities. There is a focus on municipal revenue enhancement, because that, at the end of the day, is critical. We've worked with municipalities in Uganda, among others, Kampala, where technical assistance over a 3-year time frame yielded something like a 284% increase in municipal revenues. That's almost 100% increase year on year. So that gives, all else equal, even if it leads to nothing but that, all else equal, this increases their capacity for municipal borrowing by increasing the revenues. The other thing that we work on quite a bit is this structuring of the intergovernmental fiscal transfer system, and we usually do that through a series of projects that we call the Municipal Program for Results. And what they do is they establish a formula by which the transfer of resources from national to local government occurs. Usually it tends to be a two-part formula. A part of it is endowment-based, on the basis of poverty, of population headcount, etc. And then a second part tends to try to reward performance. So it puts performance metrics, like, for instance, the increase in municipal finances year on year, and it rewards in order to incentivize a response from the municipalities. Of course, it comes with capacity building, so that those that have lesser capacity are not left behind. The work on enhancing the municipal borrowing environment always needs to start with the regulatory environment at the national level, because, oftentimes this is the foundation that is lacking to govern fiscal responsibility by subnational governments and the process by which this borrowing can happen. Obviously, South Africa is a very important case in terms of the painstaking effort that has gone through building the municipal bond market. And for those of you who are interested to know more about it, join us tomorrow in the session, and we'll reverse roles and we'll hear from the National Treasury about how they've managed to build this municipal market. Of course, there is also an investment in financial intermediaries like municipal development funds, municipal development banks, and trying to structure these to become supporters for financing within the cities, and a lot of work also on public-private partnerships, transaction support, etc. But this is also another line of work that tends to be very labor-intensive, because it requires putting in place the regulatory environment, it requires building capacity, and putting in place the conditions for risk sharing that would be attractive to bring in the private investment. So the World Bank works on all these to try to help our city clients and city partners to advance on mobilizing additional revenues, in addition to the technical assistance also that goes into thinking about instruments like land value capture, etc.
Thank you. What is your reaction to the first speaker about the situation, the scenario which they've painted around Uganda? What do you see the DFIs playing the role in that kind of a scenario or a situation?
So we're working very closely with the minister and with local government officials and leaders through a series of those programs. One is municipal support program that is providing, those formulas that of transfer to resources to municipalities. The other thing, of course, is working quite a bit on land registration, because by clarifying property rights, it becomes much easier to put in place systems, to reinforce systems like property taxation, or to put in place the systems of land value capture that the minister has been talking about. And also helping also strengthen the capacity of the municipalities. So, I mean, Uganda, as with many other countries, has a range of capacities from, Kampala to smaller municipalities that might not have the same, if you will, revenue base or land markets that could support such revenue generation. So working on a range to strengthen the capacity of local governments becomes also critical. And building that national regulatory environment for municipal debt, municipal bond markets is another also piece of the puzzle that's critical.
One last question I have for you, and I'm picking up from what Minister have said and what you've also indicated, that the land value capture, it has not been utilized by many countries or many municipalities. What are the key things? What are the key things which one wants to explore using the land value capture instruments or mechanisms? What are the things that one has to be looking up to?
So land value capture tends to fall into two groups. There's if you will, the ex ante versus the ex post. So the ex post, the most basic version of it is property taxation, which is, you as government, you put in place the infrastructure, and put in place the regulatory environment for land development, private sector builds, and then, you assess the value of that development and you collect a percentage of that value in the form of property taxation. So, I mean, at its most basic is you need the regulatory environment and you need the clear property rights that would allow you basically to put in place that system, in addition to having that cadastre of properties that is done. Now, when you don't have these ingredients in place, I mean, you can start either with a painstaking process to try to establish that cadastre, or you try to think about, maybe a faster process, for instance, of mass valuation, where you can use, satellite imagery to create the cadastre, use mass valuation techniques so that you can put in place a quick and dirty valuation of the property, so that you have a system that becomes quickly functional. So figuring out which of these systems to use becomes really critical. And then, so that's the, if you will, the ex post type of interventions. The other version of it is the betterment levies, which is, again, Colombia, you've built the road networks and then, or the public infrastructure, and then you charge the beneficiaries of that infrastructure an amount that amounts to the amount that they benefit, or that you've determined that they benefit. And again, these require quite a bit of, civic engagement, etc., for the community to be able to contribute in there. The other version that works a little bit better is the ex ante, in the sense that if you do not have the financing ability to invest in that infrastructure and then recoup part of the cost later on, the ex ante, it's the equivalent of the sale of development rights, and that you need land markets that can support that, because, I mean, if you're going to sell supplemental development rights, you need a vibrant land market where, these rights do have value rather than not. And then you need a certain also culture of, like, for instance, in Brazil, the logic is that you get a certain amount of land development as an entitlement, if you will, as part of your property ownership, but beyond that, you pay for it. So, you get a floor area ratio of 1.5 de facto, and then anything beyond that is densification potential that's being sold and which contributes to the provision of infrastructure. So having these types of instruments also requires having strong land development regulations and this type of participation.
Thank you. Wow. Let's much information to gather at the same time, but very interesting, I must say. And now let's go to the financial intermediaries. What role do financial intermediaries play in diversifying the financial resources of local and regional governments, and particularly in creating and consolidating national financial markets? And with that, I will ask Ms. Hanitra Rahajivota Ramison, who is the Director General for Local Development Fund in Madagascar. Over to you, Madam. Can you give us what are your views about these issues we're talking about?
Thank you, Mrs. Moderator. And good afternoon, everybody. I think I'm the only one who is going to speak French. I apologize for this, because I'm better with... yes. Thank you, President.
So I'm going to speak about financial intermediaries in diversification of local governments financing, particularly in the creation and consolidation of national financial markets. At the beginning of my speech, I'd like first of all to say that in Madagascar, the text and legislation allow local governments to borrow from different sources as well as financial institutions. To date, this has not been very effective, however, because we do have decrees for application which need to be under. So the presentation I'm going to make concerns particularly what exists currently about the different financial intermediaries, and then experiences we've had of different instances in this field. So the decentralization is due to the fact of because of the local autonomy, because of the improvement of the offer of goods, services, and linking putting to rights the shortcomings of the central state. This is an ethic which should inspire local government and could be response to the principle of subsidiarity to the context in which we are working for local governments is because of lack of human resources and financial resources. The proper ones don't really follow their confidence, and this is equal the weakness too of the taxation on the one hand, but also of the irregularity of transferred resources between partners. The resources can be released via decentralization, by public procurement, which gives this institutional framework which is optimal and increase the effectivity of public funds. Now, because of the lack of the wiggle room, so to speak, local governments want increasingly to make sure they have security in financing, either using direct bank loans or else an appeal to public actors, or else the issue of bonds, for example. Although most of the states have in their legislation the possibility for local governments to borrow in financial institutions, which is the case of Madagascar, or go to financial markets. And in truth, however, this possibility is not properly used by many people, particularly by local governments. Now, the conditions are drastic, and they fix the access for these local governments for borrowing. This is the first explanation for this state of affairs. Now, another reason is that the financial instruments exist and they're not properly adapted for the current situation. We also have demands coming from local governments in order to be able to benefit from access to loans. The third reason mentioned is national authorities and local authorities too of the possibility to go to financial markets, as well as ignorance of their real possibilities of debt. Even for the local governments don't know how much they can get into debt and have no idea about it, and the reason for this. Now, therefore, it's pretty obvious that we have tremendous requirements for infrastructures, particularly in less developed countries, and amenities too. These can never be satisfied by mobilization these resources, even though they are highly performing from a tax point of view, or by the mobilization of the state resources, particularly, I'm talking here particularly about African countries. So it's essential that local governments have access to credit and to financial markets in order to be up to the challenge which is increasingly imposed on them. Growth particularly, then they have resources to delegation of certain public services, local or in the private sector or PPPs. This is the first way which different governments have used currently in order to grow properly. Now this approach is particularly adapted for markets, the roads and other things, and within the running costs here, we have investments in order to have access to institutional financing, for example, for capital markets, and local governments may update their accounts, and it can thus improve their local governance if they can be have their creditworthiness and have credible when they're dealing with financial intermediaries. However, in addition to this, the state is responsible to be able to provide instruments which favors access for local governments to credit, to loans. Recently, since the 1990s, we've had developments of these specialized financial agents for local governments, or else intermediation for access for local governments to capital markets. Now, this is an initial stage in the right direction, provided that we have provided better value for in these institutions. The third sense for local governments in African governments is going to the market, is the maturity of these different issues of bonds, and these development preparations of central and local governments in Africa. They've exposed the possibilities here, which needs to be developed even further. Now, the handicap here, which coming from local governments' difficulties, particularly for middle-sized and small villages, is to have expertise in these matters. One of the reasons for this lack of expertise is that, and something we could look into, is an improvement and harmonization of budgetary nomenclature. This is an essential issue in order to improve. And even for local governments in my own country, although this access to credit has never been direct in most African countries, we have a financial intermediary, and which occupies its place in local financing institutions in Africa. We just have 3 which are specialized as being intermediate in financial intermediation for financing for local governments, particularly Development Bank of Southern Africa, the FEC in Morocco, and the IENCA in South Africa. Other institutional existence are specialized in public and their public law, and they have their state resources as well as international cooperation. Now, after the studies which I've consulted, South Africa has the most important regional experience, and local governments here in South Africa already have recourse to credit, or have had access to local markets or financial markets since the 1990s. To diversify these resources, local governments can also have launch an appeal in which this is recommended. What's recommended is resource to the diaspora which should be assessed and used in order to finance local amenities. Comparatively, financial classic, for example, like banks, only give you a loan if the local government allows taxation. Creditworthiness means that it can available for loans. And bank prices may be approval, but control is very rigorous, and they are more flexible, whereas the bond markets we're very, very restrictive. And they had need for information, and this may long outlast the actual life of the loans themselves. But anyway, we have an increase concerning public investors. These require perseverance, a concentration, dialogue, and engagement in terms of risk, measurements, and the overexploitation and the overuse of resources and increase in population, as well as the lack of ownership on the part of the population, of course, may be blocking factors for these financial intermediations. Thank you very much indeed for your listening. Thank you.
I'm going to slightly change how the program has been put in there. So instead of having somebody from private sector, I would directly go to, let's get some response from the local government perspective. And I'm going to ask Mayor Mohammed Budra to tell us what is his reaction to all this conversation.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I'm again sorry because I have an appointment later on, so why you brought me forward. I'd like first of all to thank UCLG and the FMDV for having invited me to this session, and I'd like to thank them too for the advances which they've made for our organizations concerning financing. Now, we are in this Congress of local governments, which is what we're doing. And so, thank you. For national governments, thank you. Public, private, intermediate sectors, thank you very much that you've come together with us to realize our ambitions. Now, what the municipal movement is doing is moving towards decentralization, towards regionalization. This is a vision of the world. It's a view. It's a developmental world. It's a vision of solutions. It's a vision, a territorial vision. We are the people who create wealth, and we are the architects of the future. That said, why is this the case? Because we have a vision, because we're near people. We are more familiar with the problems of the ordinary citizen. We are familiar with the solutions too. And we are more familiar with sufferings at different levels, environment, society, economy, and so on and so forth. But what's missing? Two things, basically. We need the technical side, we need the engineering, in a word, and we are missing financing too. So, what have we done? Over these past 100 years, we've understood that on our own, we're completely powerless. We have an idea, we want to organize. We want to organize a national association and then international organization like this, like UCLG. And so we have the Association of Regions, we have the president, and I'd like to congratulate him, Salam Sal. Greetings to you. We have other networks which were also with us, National Association, but all today we are together in this world group which is called UCLG, which is only 15 years old. So it's just one single generation. We are first generation UCLG. And we've thought about this long and hard together with you. We've invited you to ask you what you think about us. Minister, now I believe, for my own part, that it's not that we have too many shortcomings, but these shortcomings are more visible than other. When we talk about corruption, for example, I don't believe that corruption is that big amongst the local governments, but it's more visible. Why? Because citizens are very closely watching us. Ah, this mayor has bought a new car. But the other levels are more hidden away, shall we say. And so everything is highly visible because the ordinary citizens sees these things. So to come back now to our subject, this is a view we have of which we defend, and which in Morocco, at least, in the spirit of the constitution, in the Kingdom of Morocco, this is an absolute conviction, a national conviction. This is the way forward in order to guarantee better development. Now, so we've come up with these ideas together with you. We've organized a partnership. Of course, we have banks, we have development banks, and in Morocco too, we have development agency, we have the FEC, as you mentioned before. We also We have the two national associations. We have national associations too, and the EMPC, with the previous minister of the UCLG. We have created a project called the PEFCRI. So it's a convention which is organized both vertically and horizontally too, with the UCGDL, in order to provide ourselves with engineers, financial engineers, who can look and see how we can finance our project. This is a very important project, and we are sure it is still ongoing. We've also set up a Territorial Commission already. At a national level, we've brought together everyone to deal with this specific issue, particularly as well as climate, of course. And so here, there is no single solution, one solution fits all. We need engineering. We need to look for different solutions. We need to get together in what we call the community of practices. This is an instrument of cooperation and of exchange of ideas, which should be used and reinforced our administration to improve things. Okay, I believe that I made myself clear, I hope. We need to work harder and to be more trusting. Again, I'd like to add something else. It's not so much an idea of increasing subsidies, rather to reinforce our own financial resources. Thus is the way to respect the spirit of free administration of the communes. This requires our own resources. We should not go begging to people. We should get loans with conditions attached to them. We need to reinforce our own sources as well as partners. All right, for peer-to-peer relationships. This is the way we are going to achieve our aims in development as we see it from the territorial and local point of view. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Mayor. And I understand Mayor is going to leave because he has to leave at around 2:30, but I believe the other mayors that are remaining will represent you very well when the audience asks questions. You are excused, Mayor. Thank you. I will right away go to the private sector perspective, and I will ask Michael to give us his reaction to all this conversation. And I just have to be very unfair to the last speakers because we don't have much time. Let's try to be very brief so that we can give the audience some time to ask questions that we can respond to.
Sure, we will keep it short. Thank you. And first of all, I would like to thank UCLG for inviting Miriam to participate in this panel. It's a great honor for my company to be here today and to represent the private sector during this roundtable. Maybe I should start just by giving a very brief introduction of who we are, who is Meridiam. We are an investment company, independent, which specializes in developing, financing, and managing long-term sustainable projects in the infrastructure field, with a very strong focus on the UN SDGs. So we currently manage 7 billion of assets, which have allowed the deployment of more than 50 billion of capital through 75 projects all around the world. And in our portfolio, we have many urban projects. We have municipal hospitals, schools, courthouse, light rail transit systems, urban roads, and we also invest in new technologies like electric vehicle charging infrastructure. So going back to your question, Judy, what are the conditions for increased private sector participation in the financing of local and regional governments? I think that it's a question which is very relevant when it comes to urban infrastructure, because the needs are immense. You have urbanization first, with 70% of the world's population projected to live in cities in 2050, which will require massive infrastructure investments. And the second driver is, of course, climate change, which will require our cities to adapt which will require massive investments in urban and resilient infrastructures. And of course, this cannot be financed without the involvement of the financial and private sector. The other observation I would like to make is that there is a huge amount of liquidity which is looking for investment opportunities. If you think about it, we are in a world where almost 17 trillion of debt today is trading at a negative yield. $17 trillion. It's hard to imagine what it means. But it means that you have many commercial, institutional investors in the US, in Europe, in Asia, which are looking to invest and are desperately looking for investment opportunities. You also have the multilateral banks, like the World Bank, which could probably invest more than what they currently do, but sometimes struggle to find investable or bankable opportunities. So the challenge is really how do we create these opportunities to bring this money and this capital into our cities. When you speak to institutional investors around the world, they're all looking for stable returns and acceptable risk profile. When you speak to development banks, they are also quite risk adverse because, and we perfectly understand why, they need to protect their credit rating, so they cannot take too much risk. So for us, it's absolutely key to find solutions to de-risk municipal projects because of the complexity of urban projects, sometimes because of the size. They may be considered to be high on the risk curve. So we need to find solutions to de-risk and bring all this capital to our cities. Concretely, what does it mean? I'll give you a few examples. I think what is important when it comes to infrastructure is to spend the necessary time to prepare the projects. One illustration is the need to build consensus and alignment of interest between the different stakeholders, which is critical in our view. Investors nowadays pay more and more attention to environmental, social, and governance issues. If you have people unhappy with an investment decision, which may have a very positive effect for the city, you will need to address the issue of the people who are affected by your project. So you need to build consensus. You need also to take into account climate change when taking an investment decision, because it's critical to understand, my infrastructure project in my city, will it resist over the long term to adverse, climate events, for example? I think it's important because the investors will ask this question, and it's also important because answering to this question will allow creating stakeholder alignment. So building consensus is really a prerequisite to favor private sector involvement over the long term. Another example is illustration of how we can create private sector involvement is to think on the size of the investment. Sometimes when you look at projects in cities, they could be small size. So how do you address size? Do you address the issue of size? Of course, the wrong answer would be to oversize your needs, but you have answers. For example, aggregation of projects to reach a minimum size which becomes investable. For example, cities can, instead of renovating one or two schools, could launch a program to renovate all the schools of the cities and the surrounding cities. This will create the size which is necessary to attract investors. Another important point is, of course, the contractual model that you choose when a city decides to outsource to the private sector a public service. You have many options. The minister was referring to PPP projects, concession projects. You have direct procurements. You have many different ways to outsource an infrastructure or a public service. But depending on your choice, you can end up with a model which works, or you can end up with something which is not sustainable over the long term and that you will never be able to finance. So these are a few examples of how what cities could do to prepare projects, to help preparing projects. But of course, it's not only the public sector which has the solution. The private sector needs to play a role alongside cities to make the project investable and bankable. And at Meridiam, we are convinced that there is a need to de-risk projects through project preparation that can be done also by the private sector. And the last point is, a more financial comment. But another way to bring capital into city, to bring private capital into cities, could be, through smart structuring, credit enhancement, blended finance solutions, which will, by using in an efficient way the different sources of financing which are available, we can also mobilize, commercial capital. So with the support of the donors, of the multilateral banks, we can put in place credit enhancement structures, which will de-risk projects, improve the credit profile of the projects, and therefore attract the very large pockets of institutional capital. And this is something that Meridiam, we did successfully, for example, in Turkey, where we structured the first project bond for a municipal hospital in the city of Elazig. And this is something that we are actively working on with UCLG, FMDV, and other stakeholders like UNCDF.
Thank you. Let's go straight to the research and information. What can you say about the need for understanding, better understanding multi-level governance and local regional government financing system to inform action? What do you say about that?
Okay, thank you for the question. And indeed, in this panel, we talk a lot about land value capture, taxation system, intergovernmental fiscal system, innovative solutions, PPP, blended finance, de-risking, and all of that. And all those issues require proper information system and data. And there are three ways, actually, we can think about the role of the information system and the need for data. First one is the need to boost investment and look at what are the global information that we can get, compare, simplify, and understand what are the international trends and the needs at the national level. So boost investment. The second issue is about build institutions. And indeed, data are also necessary to build and to develop a fiscal decentralization mechanism and system. And the third issue regarding data is also the need to initiate local economic development. And in this respect, data are also necessary. So let me come back on those three dimensions. First, regarding the need to boost investment. And we worked with UCLG and the OECD on this World Observatory on subnational finance and investment. And it is part of this global advocacy that we want to do in terms of looking at what is happening in the world, how the cities are financed. And we got very interesting results from that. And let me give you a few of them, few examples, and especially regarding the least developed countries and the African countries. So what we show is that first, data are very difficult to gather, and most of the time they're not there. But when they are there, we can see that actually local authorities represent 20% of the public spend, compared to the OECD, where it's 46%. So a huge difference where the needs are in those secondary cities in least developed countries. At the same time, cities are not present. When you look at the share in terms of tax revenue in public tax revenue, cities represent 4.3% of the public revenue in least developed countries, compared to 14.9% on average. So it shows that decentralization cannot only be a political agenda. It's not only about accountability and citizen participation, but it's also public delivery and building infrastructure. And we are not there for now. So that's the first thing that data help us to do. And of course, it speaks to the need to get more financial, to expand the financial ecosystem and to find innovative solutions. And the mayor of Al Osema was speaking about that. We need to find new mechanisms. Second dimension is about building system. And here, data are also very important. Why? Because with data, you can create a dialogue between the national and the local level. So you can create a discussion around effectiveness, accountability, and you can create allocation mechanism for the central government to be able to allocate funds appropriately to the local authorities. And you can also create the dialogue between local authorities and citizens, because then you have objective mechanisms to shape this dialogue in a way that is really sustainable and that creates really this social contract at the local level. It's also a way to strengthen the capacities, because having data and putting information system into the fiscal decentralization mechanism help the national government to build allocation mechanisms, but also to develop its audit system, to develop its own monitoring system. It's also a way to help the local authority to monitor their resource mobilization efforts, for instance, or to better deliver their services. So that's the second dimension. And then the last one is, of course, we need data, and municipalities need data to be able to initiate the local economic development. Why? Because the economy is the basis of their fiscal system. Without knowing their economy and without being able to engage into creating an enabling environment for the municipalities, you cannot have local development. You do not have municipalities that are efficient and should play the role that they should in terms of SDG delivery. So this is the third dimension that are very important. Information system needs to be built at the global level for this global advocacy, and we are all here for that, at the national level to really develop and build system and mechanism, and for the municipalities to make them understand their local economy and their local reality. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Christine. I'm now going to ask the respondent from the mayors or from the representative of local government. The mayor has already given his views about what he thinks about all this discussion, but we do have two remaining speakers that are going to give us their views on what are their take about what we have heard from the financiers, what we have heard from the national government. What are they saying? And on that note, I will ask Mr. Ahmed, a mayor of Dori in Burkina Faso, to respond to.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Yes. Thank you very much. I thought you did not want me to speak, and you wanted to let the private sectors and the local governments have a final say. No, I have to react. I'll switch in French if you don't mind to express some of those views maybe clearer.
First of all, I'd like to thank UCLG for their invitation to the modest Burkina Faso. Thanks to UCLG for bringing me into the issue of finance onto this table, because when we meet in this kind of meeting, it's easy to be idealistic. And so sometimes listening to people see from the private or public sectors, we have the impression that everyone has an ideal, but where's reality? Where are we in that reality? I was recently in a meeting where even we're talking about the SDGs, we saw that many countries are not even on board SDGs. And so on these essential issues like access for basic social services, what about that? We've seen that somewhere there's a mismatch between discourse and reality. Okay. We are in a context where practically all countries have adopted decentralization. Very often we wonder whether this decentralization was imposed by donor countries rather than a political choice of their own. Because countries are not when I listen to the Ministry of Uganda, I want to take my hand and to bring it to my ministers and talk to them about decentralization, but do not vote the efforts made in our different countries. But we are not under the same banner. We have political discourses favorable to decentralization. This is something very, very good. But truth, the reality difference. When you take, for example, what happens in a country which I know best, West African countries, for example. There's a difference when applying what's applied there and applied elsewhere. Even though certain countries have not employed their own texts, we have decentralization to have our donors content. When it comes to making this decentralization really effective, we are light years away. As I've said before, we have decentralized the problem. We've not decentralized the solutions. In all our countries, we have different policies which are sometimes there's a difference between our countries and our governments, and local governments, which means that states come quickly to the groups in order to, for taxes, and small countries. Sorry, the microphone has gone off. Microphone is cut out. Apologies, the microphone is cut out. We can't hear. The interpreters can't hear. Hello? Yeah. Sorry, gone again. Sorry. The state is very quick when it comes to collecting taxes, very, very quick, but the transfer mechanism of these taxes back to the local governments means could be improved. And there is very, very suspicious slowness about this. So we could say that is a lack of dialogue, and because of this lack of dialogue, perhaps it's a lack of trust. It's important to set up mechanisms by which central states and local governments debate about the specific situation. Central governments, as has been said, don't have the same capabilities to appreciate the mobilization of their own resources. So this means the state gets more taxes than something local government gets more than the local government, but the responsibilities which are given back to the central government, we talk about education, health, for example, water and environment, as we've heard, and climate change. It's important that we should have a resource transfer system which puts on an equal footing with the central government. But there's a mismatch in many, many cases. There's a mismatch too. When we talk about the transfer rates and the countries and those countries in which these transfers are made. This is the second, if it's not the second half of the year, it's later on. And so very often we find ourselves in cases where we have the most of the governments means are sent the following year. And we talk about other difficulties too, capacity of absorbing of these governments. We need to have a frank, open dialogue about these aims. States take on board commitments, whether it's dealing with climate change commitments concerning, for example, sustainable development, but we need the politicians need to put their money where their mouths are, and we need actions, not more words. In certain countries, local governments have access to banks. In other countries, this is not the case. And so they depend a great deal on state resource transfers. And so in countries, there's one Western African country where the transfer tax of the central government towards local governments is changed between 20 or 15%, but in Western Africa, in most cases, 5 or 6%. When you transfer 5 or 6%, and you said that you're responsible for water, health, education, sanitation, and whatever, it's basically racing forward and moving backwards. This is the situation vis-à-vis to the local resources. Local governments they're not under the same flag. We're not reaching the same page. I don't know what happens in your districts, but certain districts are mining districts in my country. We have companies who mine a great deal and who reinvest. But there are certain local governments who are not lucky enough to have direct access to mobilize their own resources. They depend on state transfers. They depend on decentralized transfers. Now, in certain countries like mine, local governments get more benefit from decentralized cooperation than from central state transfer. This is not normal because decentralized cooperation is in the head of the country. There's no formula to apply so that every district can have its own percentage for its budget, which comes from decentralized cooperation. This depends on the capacity of the mayors to go along and knock on the door to see what resources can be mobilized. So this is a mismatch. This is inadequate. This is not realistic. And so I believe that we need, for those of us who accept the principle of decentralization, we need to apply real decentralization. They need to apply the text which they've signed via review mechanisms and debate mechanisms so that we have better trust, more exchange. Perhaps by achieving this, the resources transferred will be greater, will be more realistic vis-a-vis the responsibilities which have also been transferred. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. We heard from the mayor. And lastly, and if I can get the last speaker to give us her comments or her reaction to all these issues from the IMIF. So if you can give us your views on what has been going on in terms of the engagement.
That's you?
Yes.
Good afternoon. And thank you. I am extremely happy and honored to be here with you on it's the most important global forum, the World Summit of Local and Regional Leaders, which offers the privilege of getting together those who dream big even despite their lack of financial or technical resource, and those who want to direct their resource and expertise towards and developing a better world. If you are here today, it's because we decided to be the actors of the change. But we wanted in our communities, actor of building an innovative world based on relevant and sustainable local development. We want a world where a human society's production system will be in harmony with nature. A world where energy efficiency and eco-cities will become a reality, not just a concept. A world without climate risk, without hunger, without unprocessed waste, with clean water and flourishing nature. A world with a more cost-efficient progress. It is certain what we can develop as a society only an active partnership and by promoting innovative ideas and concrete development policies for our communities. This is why it's time for a new approach in local development policies. You are aware to the need to identity and promote social human policies designed to ensure a decent living for the population, safety for families, jobs, and comfort for personal development. It is important to have bold ideas to make a radical change in the old paradigm and to avoid some mistake in the process of urbanization and local development. For this reason, I am opting and fundraising for sustainable infrastructure project to use our know-how and modern technologies to build smart cities and towns with happy people and revived nature, no longer endangered by climate change, pollution, or indifference. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our time is well spent, and thank you to the panelists, but I want to ask if there are any 1 or 2 questions from the floor that you want to raise or rather react to the discussions. Unfortunately, I'm told that while Serge is moving the mic, that the room is needed for another session. So we just have 1, 2 questions very quickly and respond to them very quickly, and then we'll adjourn the session. Sir?
Yes, hello everyone, and thanks for the intervention of each of you. Just a quick one on funding. So I've heard the gentleman from the private sector speaking about funding of a number of infrastructure projects. Basically, there are various mechanisms to fund projects. We still speak about PPP, but PPP now means have a different meaning in our today's competitive environment, very oriented towards business. I believe that local government need to open more their doors to welcome private investors, and the local government need to act as facilitators and encourage investors to, on the one hand, bring in their own funding, try to propose projects that will create, on the one hand, employment, creative activities, making the city more lively. And there are several projects like that that has been implemented. I'm basically from Mauritius, and right at the moment, we are working on a big infrastructure project in the capital city, where the investment is 100% private, and the city is just bringing the plot of land in the middle of the city on a BOT basis. So I just want to end on that one, because I know time is counted, but it's to say that funds are out there. It depends how you frame it and how you welcome investors.
Okay, thank you. I would take that as more of a comment other than being a question. And I'm told we have to leave the room unless if there's a change. But I think on that note, Serge, we'll have to close the session. If you have any questions, you have seen the panelists, you can note the person that you want to specifically ask the question to, and you can just go to them personally and ask them. And on that note, I want to thank you for your ears, because you didn't exchange in terms of asking from our side, and also want to thank our panelists for the fruitful discussion. Thank you very much.